The wind didn't just blow in the Ardennes, it cut through wool, skin, and bone like a serrated knife. It was December 1944. The temperature had plunged below zero. The forests of Belgium were a white, frozen hell. Inside the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was dying. They were surrounded, cut off. German panzers were tightening the noose from every direction. Ammunition was down to 10 rounds per rifle. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men froze to death in cellars because there was no morphine to dull the pain and no blankets to keep them warm. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at the situation map in Versailles, and for the first time since D-Day, he saw disaster. His intelligence officers told him the 101st had 4 days, maybe 5. After that, the Screaming Eagles wouldn't be captured. They would be annihilated, wiped from the earth. There was no one close enough to save them. Montgomery was too far north, too cautious. Bradley's forces were reeling. The only army with the combat power to break the German ring was the Third Army. But they were 100 miles south, fully engaged in a brutal offensive against the Saar. To save Bastogne, that army would have to stop fighting, turn 90 degrees in a blizzard, and attack into the teeth of the German advance. It was a maneuver that military textbooks said was impossible. It required moving 25,000 men and 13,000 vehicles over icy, single-lane roads in 48 hours. When Eisenhower asked his generals how long it would take, they pulled out slide rules and logistics tables. They said 4 days to prepare, a week to attack. Then George S. Patton stood up. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and said 6 words that made the room go silent. "I can attack in 48 hours. The other generals laughed. They thought he was lying. They thought he was grandstanding. Eisenhower thought he had lost his mind. But Patton wasn't lying, and what happened next would break the spine of the German army. The conference room at Verdun was freezing. The heating system had failed, and 16 senior Allied commanders sat huddled in their heavy overcoats, their breath visible in the damp air. The atmosphere was just as cold. The German Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge had caught them all with their pants down. Hitler had launched 2,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks into the thinly held American lines. The front was collapsing. American units were dissolving in panic. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a grim attempt at optimism. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." It sounded absurd, but Eisenhower knew that if they could strike the German flanks, they could turn the enemy's trap into a killing ground. He turned to Patton. "George, how soon can you attack north?" Patton didn't hesitate. He didn't check his notes. The morning of December 22nd, he said flatly, "With 3 divisions, that was 48 hours away." The room erupted. A few British officers rolled their eyes. One of Bradley's staff officers whispered, "He's bluffing. There's no way." Even Eisenhower, who knew Patton better than anyone, was skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George," he warned. "I'm asking what you can actually do." Eisenhower needed a real answer, not theater. If Patton launched a premature, uncoordinated attack, his army could be cut to pieces, and the 101st would be doomed. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He had done something no one else in that room had thought to do. Days earlier, while other commanders were ignoring the intelligence reports, Patton had smelled the danger. He had already ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for a 90-degree turn north. While the other generals were driving to Verdun, Patton's staff was already issuing code words. "I'm not bluffing," Ike Patton said. "My staff has the orders ready. The troops will move tonight." Eisenhower looked at him. The tension in the room was suffocating. He had a choice: trust the cautious calculations of his staff or trust the gut instinct of the most difficult, insubordinate general in the U.S. Army. He chose Patton, but he gave him a warning that chilled the room. George Eisenhower said, his voice low, "If you fail, If those paratroopers are lost because you promised what you couldn't deliver, there will be consequences." Patton lit a cigar, smiled, and said, "I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas." The clock started ticking the moment Patton walked out of that room. The logistics of what happened next are staggering. Patton had to disengage an entire army that was actively fighting the Germans in the Saar region. He had to pull 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry out of the line, spin them north, and march them 100 miles over icy roads that were already choked with retreating traffic. It was like trying to stop a runaway freight train and throw it into reverse in the middle of a blizzard. The weather was the worst Europe had seen in 38 years. Temperatures dropped so low that tank engines had to be run every 20 minutes just to keep the oil from freezing solid. Trucks slid off icy roads into ravines. Men marched with frozen feet, their boots wrapped in burlap sacks. But Patton was relentless. He was everywhere. He rode in an open jeep, his face purple from the cold, screaming at truck drivers pushing artillery columns forward, threatening officers who hesitated. "Never stop moving," he told his tankers. "If you stop, you die." While Patton drove his men, the situation in Bastogne was deteriorating. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st, had received a German surrender ultimatum. His response was a single word: nuts. It was legendary defiance, but defiance doesn't stop tank shells. The German 47th Panzer Corps was hammering the perimeter. They captured the hospital. They overran the forward outposts. The Americans were bleeding out. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. The skies cleared. Patton, who had famously ordered his chaplain to write a prayer for good weather, watched as hundreds of C-47 transport planes filled the sky. They dropped tons of ammunition and plasma into Bastogne. At the same time, American P-47 Thunderbolts dove on the German columns, turning their tanks into burning coffins. "It's the Lord's work," Patton said, watching the German armor burn. "And my weather prayer worked." But air power wasn't enough. The 101st needed tanks on the ground. They needed a corridor. Leading the spearhead was the 4th Armored Division, specifically Combat Command B under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was a cigar-chewing tanker who fought exactly like Patton. He didn't believe in stopping. On December the 26th, Abrams was 4 miles from Bastogne. Between him and the paratroopers lay the village of Eisenhower, heavily defended by German paratroopers and anti-tank guns. Standard doctrine said to wait for infantry support. Halt. Plan an assault. Abrams looked at his watch. He knew the 101st didn't have time for doctrine. He keyed his radio. "We're going in," he said. Do not stop for anything. At 4:50 p.m. on December the 26th, a line of Sherman tanks roared toward Bastogne. They didn't stop to shoot, they fired on the move. They smashed through German roadblocks, crushing enemy machine gun nests under their treads. The lead tank, a Sherman named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, burst through the tree line. Boggess popped the hatch. He saw figures in olive drab dug into the snow ahead. He didn't know if they were Germans or Americans. He shouted a password. A helmet popped up from a foxhole. It was an engineer from the 326th Airborne Battalion. He stared at the tank, then grinned. "Come on in," Boggess radioed back. "The water's fine." They had done it. In 7 days, Patton's Third Army had moved faster and fought harder than any army in history. They had broken the siege. Back at headquarters, the phone rang. Eisenhower picked it up. It was Patton. George Eisenhower said. Ike Patton's voice crackled over the static. "We're through to Bastogne." For a moment, Eisenhower couldn't speak. The relief was physical. The weight of the entire Western Front had been resting on this gamble. If Patton had failed, the war could have dragged on for another year. Eisenhower, a man known for his stoic control, reportedly had tears in his eyes. "George," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you did it. You saved them." Patton, typically brash, simply replied, "Just doing my job, Ike." But Eisenhower corrected him. "No, George. You accomplished something I wasn't sure was possible. You saved 1,000 men." Later, Eisenhower would write that the relief of Bastogne was the most brilliant operation of the war. He admitted to his staff that despite all the headaches Patton caused, the slapping incidents, the insults to Montgomery, the PR nightmares, he was the indispensable man. "I'd trade a whole division for one Patton," he reportedly said, but perhaps the greatest validation didn't come from Eisenhower. It came from the enemy. Deep in the German high command, the mood was apocalyptic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the old Prussian master of warfare, had watched the map with growing horror. He had counted on American slowness. He had counted on the weather. He had counted on Montgomery's caution. When reports came in that Patton had turned an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours and struck the German flank, Rundstedt was stunned. "Patton is the most dangerous opponent," he later told interrogators. "He fights like we do." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, was even more blunt. "We knew Patton would react," he said, "but we expected it to take a week. When he attacked after 3 days, we knew it was over." Hitler himself, huddled in his bunker, reportedly flew into a rage. He had specifically ordered the offensive to strike the seam between the British and American armies because he thought the Allies couldn't coordinate. He never expected one American general to simply ignore the rules of logistics and physics. The German retreat from the Bulge wasn't just a withdrawal, it was a rout. They left behind their tanks, their artillery, and their dreams of victory buried in the snows of the Ardennes. George Patton was a complicated man. He was arrogant, difficult, and often cruel. But on that frozen December week in 1944, he was exactly what the world needed. He didn't just relieve a town. He proved that the American soldier, often dismissed by the Europeans as an amateur, could outmarch, outfight, and outthink the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. When the 101st Airborne was asked if they needed to be rescued, their commander famously quipped, "No, we just needed someone to give us a lift." But the truth is, without Patton's impossible drive, the graves at Henri-Chapelle would be filled with thousands more American boys. Eisenhower knew it. The Germans knew it. And history remembers it. War does not whisper, it roars. And in the winter of 1944, George Patton roared louder than them all. If you want to hear more stories about the raw, gritty reality of military history stories, the textbooks leave out. Hit that subscribe button. We're digging up the past one battle at a time. This is the Investigator's Archive. Dismissed.